As we continue our journey into the land of thinking, it becomes quickly apparent that thinking occurs in repetitive patterns that might be slightly different for each person, but which follow a common path. And so what the mind does to ensnare you and capture your attention is that it hooks onto the very suffering that it caused by itself, and then blames something in your world for that suffering. So the reason that we feel unhappy is because we're caught up in past and future, and we're caught up in thought. So because of that, we have some feelings of dissatisfaction within us. And the mind grabs onto those feelings of dissatisfaction and then says, okay, well, that's because of your job, or that's because of your partner, or that's because you don't have enough money. And then it spins a whole lot of stories around that macro story. It spins a whole lot of micro stories underneath it and says, see, yep, here's where you don't have enough money, and here's where you don't have enough money, and this is why that's happening. And so when those stories play on repeat and we believe them, then that feeling of unease grows, and then the mind's explanation makes even more sense. So in a way, it reverse engineers your suffering and then creates a story around that reinforces the need for some change in the future. And of course, past and future are the biggest tools of the mind, because it says the reason you're unhappy is because this happened in the past, or this didn't happen in the past. And if you do this in the future, then you'll be happy. So for me, a critical time when I was in this land of thinking stage of the practice came when I had a job that I was really unhappy with, and a manager who I found really difficult to deal with. And so I felt a lot of suffering because I was spending my time thinking about it instead of living my life moment to moment. And when I felt that suffering, then my mind says, this is because of your nasty boss, and if only you would stand up to her and say this or that, or take this action, or quit, then you would be happy. But because you won't, then you're not happy, and that means that you're a coward and you're useless and you can't do conflict and blah blah blah. And so it created this is the perfect storm for mind, is when it can seize on something external and then also turn it into an internal. Like, there's this problem with you, and so not only do you need to step up and resolve this external thing, but you also need to do some work to be a better person so that you can be happy. So you need to learn to deal with X, Y, or Z more effectively. And so, I had some insight into the workings of the mind then. Not enough to keep me from getting lost in it, but enough not to go on a big quest of learning how to become a better conflict doer. But for many people, they then go on to these big external hunts that are fine in and of themselves, but they can be a distraction from our true work, which is disengaging from the mind, which is learning to observe without getting caught up in all that stuff. When we humour the mind and go on all these side paths, we spend a whole lot of time and energy on them, and we also feed that thinking, with a whole lot of attention. So, when you look back on your life and things that you pursued and things that you chased that maybe you didn't enjoy in and of themselves, but were just a means to an end or a means to try and solve some problem. If you look closely at those things, you'll see that little voice that was whispering in your ear at the start and saying, hey, life would be better if you just lost a little bit of weight. The reason you're unhappy is because when you look in the mirror, you see what you see. And if you just could lose this amount, then you'd be happy. But right now it's impossible because, you're not as you should be. And that's the basic position of the mind, is you're not as you should be, or life is not as it should be, and therefore you're unhappy. But, this is the salesman, but, if you follow my path, you follow my 10-step plan, then in the near future, or in the future, distant is better, because then there's more time for it to hold our attention. In the future, if you do this correctly, then you'll be happy. And if you don't, you'll be miserable forever. It's not so overt as that usually, but this is essentially what the mind's telling us. And when we're lost in that, it's a really difficult place to be. So for today's written exercise, I want you to look back through your past and just find a time where you chased something externally or tried to change something about you because your mind was telling you that this was the cause of your unhappiness. Because if we can recognize this pattern, then we can avoid getting lost in it when it comes up again, which it will. So take a few minutes now to do the written exercise for today, to work through what that looked like, what the mind said and did, to keep you engaged in that process. And have a look then at things in your own life now that may be manifestations of the same pattern. And when we come back tomorrow, we'll look into, how do we start to cut those ties? How do we move out of this pattern of being lost in thought and start to find the awareness underneath it? My name's Ollie Doyle, and I want to thank you for joining me on this mindfulness mini course, and I'll be back tomorrow with more adventures in the land of thinking.